Welcome to Crimson Secrets. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We put out new stories every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I love seeing where our community is spread across the country. Now settle in, because today's story is one of those that's going to stay with you. The morning Harlan Whitfield handed his wife the papers, he was smiling. Not a cruel smile, not exactly, more the smile of a man who had decided something and felt the relief of a decision made. He set the folder on the kitchen counter between them, like it was a bill he was finally getting around to paying. "I had Marcus draw these up," he said. "I think we both know this has been over for a long time." Faye Whitfield looked at the folder. She looked at her husband. She had been awake since 4 a.m, not because of insomnia, but because she had a conference call with Geneva at 4:15 and a follow-up with the Meridian Group at 6. She had not slept more than 5 hours in 3 nights. She was wearing the blazer she'd laid out the night before, because she knew she wouldn't have time to think about it in the morning. She didn't open the folder. "Okay," she said. That was it. That was all she said. And Harlan, who had prepared himself for tears or arguments or the particular kind of cold fury his wife occasionally deployed, found himself strangely disarmed by that single word. "Okay?" he repeated. "I'll have someone look at it this week." She picked up her coffee. "I have to go." She walked out of the kitchen, out through the front door of the house they had shared for 11 years, and into the gray Connecticut morning. Harlan stood at the counter with the folder still sitting between where they had been standing, and thought, for just a moment, that something had gone wrong with the way that conversation was supposed to go. He had no idea. Faye Marchand had met Harlan Whitfield at a fundraiser in 2013 when she was 29 years old and working as a junior research director at a small biotech firm in New Haven. He was 34, already a partner at his father's commercial real estate firm, the kind of man who wore his confidence the way other people wear good shoes, quietly. But you noticed. He was funny in a dry, unhurried way, and he listened when she talked about her work, which was more than she could say for most people at those events. They got married 18 months later. His family had money. Her family had education and grit, and a mother who still worked 60 hours a week at 63. The marriage looked good at a point of pride, and for a few years, it felt pretty good from the inside, too. The cracks started small. A dinner she missed because a trial ran long. A vacation she cut short because the FDA response came back with questions. Harlan didn't yell. He was never the yelling type. He went quiet in a way that took up more space than yelling would have, and slowly the quiet became the architecture of their home. By the time Faye realized how far apart they had drifted, she was deep inside the work that would define the rest of her life, and she didn't know how to explain it to him in a way that would make him understand without sounding like she was choosing it over him. The truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that she was trying to do both, and some nights she lay awake doing the math and knowing it didn't add up. And she didn't know how to tell him that either. She had been working for 6 years on a drug delivery mechanism for early-stage pancreatic cancer. Not a cure, she was careful never to use that word, but an intervention. A way of getting a therapeutic compound past the dense cellular barrier that made pancreatic tumors so resistant to treatment. Her team at Vantage Biosciences had been running trials for 3 years. The data was good. The data, in the careful and measured language of peer review, was remarkable. She had not told Harlan any of this, not because she was hiding it, or not entirely. It was more that every time she tried to explain the work, she could see his eyes doing the thing, where they stayed, politely focused, while his mind went somewhere else. And eventually, she stopped trying, and eventually, that became its own kind of distance. What she had not told him, what she had not told anyone outside her team, and the 3 board members who had been quietly shepherding the process, was that Vantage Biosciences had been in acquisition talks with Arundel Pharmaceutical for the better part of 8 months, and that the deal, if it closed, was valued at just over $1.1 billion, and that Faye, as the co-founder and chief scientific officer, who held 22% equity in the company, stood to clear somewhere in the range of $240 million when the ink dried. The ink, as of the morning Harlan handed her divorce papers, was 3 weeks away from drying. She had known the marriage. She had known the marriage was ending. She wasn't deluded about that. She'd known it for probably 2 years. The way you know a season is changing before you can name the exact day it turned. What she hadn't expected was the timing. She sat in the back of the car on the way to the office and looked out the window at the November trees and did something she almost never let herself do in transit. She sat with it, the folder on the counter. Harlan's smile. The 11 years. The way he had said, "I think we both know," as if she should be grateful for his honesty, as if he were releasing her from something she'd been too polite to ask to leave. She thought about the first apartment they'd shared, the one with the radiator that clanged all winter and the kitchen window that looked out onto a brick wall. She thought about the trip to Portugal for their 5th anniversary, the fish market in Lisbon where he had made her try things she couldn't identify, and then laughed when she liked all of them. She thought about the hospital when her father had his stroke 4 years ago, and how Harlan had driven 4 hours in the middle of the night and held her hand in the waiting room without saying a single word. She let herself feel all of it, for exactly the duration of the car ride. When the driver pulled up outside the Vantage building, she took a breath, put the feeling somewhere interior, and latched the door, and walked inside. She had work to do. The person who might have told you what Faye was going through during those 3 weeks was her assistant, a 26-year-old named Petra. No, not Petra. Her assistant's name was Soleil. No. Her assistant was a young woman named Claudette Ossie, who had worked with Faye for 4 years and had developed a kind of professional telepathy that Faye relied on more than she ever said out loud. Claudette knew about the divorce papers on a Wednesday because Faye came in with an expression that Claudette had learned to read. Jaw slightly set, eyes a little too focused, the specific composure of a person who has recently made a decision to be composed. She didn't ask. She brought Faye's usual coffee, moved the 11 o'clock to 11:30, and quietly blocked 2 hours on Friday afternoon with no label. She also noticed that Faye worked later than usual that week, stayed past 9 2 nights in a row, left her lunch untouched on Tuesday. What she didn't know, what she wasn't supposed to know, was that during those late nights, Faye was finalizing the last round of due diligence responses for the Arundel acquisition. The deal had been moving on a timeline coordinated between 4 law firms, 2 sets of bankers, and a regulatory compliance team that had been working essentially around the clock since October. Faye's piece of it, the part only she could provide, was the scientific validation package, the raw trial data, the methodology documentation, the answers to 37 highly specific questions that Arundel's science team had submitted 2 weeks prior. Each answer had to be precise. Each answer would be scrutinized by people whose job it was to find reasons to walk away. Each answer had to be the kind of unimpeachable that could survive 5 years of post-acquisition audit. She worked with the focus of someone who had been building toward this moment for a decade because she had been every late night, every missed dinner, every conference she'd attended instead of the vacation. Every time she had chosen the lab over the living room and understood, in the quiet part of herself, that she was spending something that couldn't be earned back. She had chosen this. She had made that choice a long time ago, and she didn't flinch from it, not even now. But she understood, sitting at her desk at 10:30 on a Thursday night in November, that the cost of it had been real. Harlan, meanwhile, told 3 people about the divorce within the first week. His brother Rob, who said finally before he could stop himself and then tried to walk it back. His college roommate, Danny, who took him out for drinks and spent most of the evening talking about his own marriage, which Harlan found less helpful than intended. And Kelsey. Kelsey Vance had been in their social circle for about 2 years. She was 31, worked in marketing for a lifestyle brand, and had a way of laughing at everything. Harlan said that he had found flattering before he recognized it as a strategy. He would tell himself later, when he had more perspective, that he hadn't started anything with Kelsey while he was still married. That was technically true. He also knew when he was being honest with himself, that the conversation in the kitchen would not have happened when it did if Kelsey hadn't existed. He told himself Faye would have wanted to know, that she deserved the chance to move on, that this was, in some abstract way, a kindness. His brother Rob, who had seen the look on Harlan's face when he said Kelsey's name, did not say anything about this. Rob had learned when to keep his mouth shut. The signing was scheduled for the third Tuesday in November. Faye drove herself to the offices of Callaway and Brandt in downtown Hartford, which is a choice that surprised even Claudette, who had offered 3 times to arrange a car. She needed the 20 minutes alone in a way she couldn't easily explain. She parked in the structure on Ann Street and sat in the car for a moment before she went in. She thought about her mother, who was a high school chemistry teacher for 31 years, and who had told Faye when she was 12 years old that the most important thing a woman could do was build something that couldn't be taken from her. Her mother had meant education. Faye had taken it further. She thought about her team, the 14 people who had worked alongside her for years, several of whom had turned down better-paying offers elsewhere because they believed in what they were building. She thought about Dr. Augustine Kwame, her co-founder, who had called her the night before and said, very simply, "We did it, Faye," and then gone quiet in the way people go quiet when emotion is too large for language. She got out of the car. The conference room at Callaway and Brandt was on the 11th floor, with windows that looked out toward the river. There were 12 people at the table when she walked in, and 4 more joining by video. The lead counsel for Arundel, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Philippa Osi, no relation to Claudette, had checked once, nodded when Faye entered. The bankers arranged their folders. Someone brought water. Faye sat down, placed her portfolio on the table, and looked at the 12 faces looking back at her. She had presented to scarier rooms. Rooms where the people across the table had the power to shut down a trial with a single memo. Rooms where she'd had to defend 5 years of work against 20 minutes of aggressive questioning and come out without showing a single crack. She had learned long ago that the work was the armor. If the work was right, the room couldn't touch her. The work was right. They went through the final terms. There were 4 minor points still to resolve, all of them anticipated. All of them navigated in the previous 2 weeks. Philippa's team raised 1 additional question about the Phase 2 timeline documentation, and Faye answered it with the specific, unhurried clarity of someone who has the information stored not in a file, but in her body. The room went quiet for a moment after she finished. Then the documents came out. She signed her name 11 times. She was aware in some part of her mind that was running parallel to the professional version of herself, sitting in that room, that this was the kind of moment people imagine, but rarely experience. The moment when something you have spent years building becomes real in a way that can be measured. $243 million on paper, in her name. She kept her face quiet. After she shook hands with Philippa, she shook hands with the bankers. She said the appropriate things. She rode the elevator down with Augustine, who was not keeping his face quiet. He was beaming with a kind of unguarded happiness that Faye found, in that moment, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "Dinner," he said. "Dinner," she agreed. In the car, alone, she called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring the way she always did, and Faye said, "Mom, we closed." And her mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Oh, baby," in a voice Faye hadn't heard since the day she defended her dissertation. And Faye, for the first time in a very long time, let herself cry. Not much. Just enough. Then she drove home. She had told almost no one. That was the part that came out later, and that people found, depending on their disposition, either admirable or baffling. The acquisition was announced publicly on a Thursday morning, 5 days after the signing. Arundel put out a press release at 7 a.m. The business press picked it up quickly. $1 billion biotech acquisition was notable, but what made it a story was the science. The mechanism Faye's team had developed was described in the coverage as a potential breakthrough in oncology drug delivery. The New York Times ran it on the front page of the business section. There was a photograph of Faye from a conference 2 years prior, looking exactly the way she looked in most photographs. Direct, slightly impatient, as if she had things to get back to. Harlan saw it on his phone at breakfast. He read the headline. He read it again. He looked at the photograph. He read the first 3 paragraphs, which described the deal's value, the science involved, and the company's co-founder, Dr. Faye Whitfield, in terms that took a moment to fully register. He sat with his coffee, getting cold. His brother called at 8:15. Rob didn't say anything for a moment either. Then he said, "Harlan." "I see it," Harlan said. "Did you know?" The pause that followed that question was long enough that Rob got his answer. The calls started coming in that afternoon. People Faye hadn't heard from in years. People who had been at their wedding. People who had been at their wedding and then drifted into the particular kind of social silence that happens when a couple becomes 2 people who just happen to share a calendar. Everyone was warm. Everyone was enthusiastic. Everyone wanted to have dinner. Faye's phone rang 47 times before Claudette quietly took over and began managing responses. Harlan did not call. He thought about it. He picked up the phone twice. Both times he put it back down without dialing. What would he say? Congratulations? The word felt like it belonged to a different conversation in a different life. I didn't know. That was true. But saying it out loud would require him to hear what it sounded like, and he was not ready for that. What he kept coming back to, in the quiet of the house that suddenly felt very large, was a specific memory. It was from maybe 4 years ago, a Sunday afternoon. Faye had been at the kitchen table with her laptop, working. She was always working. And he had come in and asked what she was doing, and she had started to explain. Something about a delivery mechanism and a cellular barrier. He had listened for about 2 minutes, then he had said, "Sounds complicated," and gone to watch the game. She had looked at him for a moment before she went back to her screen. He had not thought about that look in 4 years. He thought about it. Now, the divorce was finalized in February. Faye had hired a good attorney. Not aggressively good, just thorough, and the process was unremarkable. The house sold quickly, their assets divided without drama. There was one conversation early in the process where Harlan's attorney raised the question of whether Faye's equity in Vantage constituted marital property, given that the company had been founded during the marriage. That conversation lasted a single session. Faye's attorney, a silver-haired woman, Dorothea Blaine, who had been doing family law for 30 years and had seen every variation of this argument, laid out the documentation with the efficiency waiting patiently for this exact question. The equity structure, the vesting schedule, the founder agreements predating the acquisition by 3 years, Faye's individual contribution to the intellectual property. Harlan's attorney folded the inquiry within the hour. Harlan did not fight it. That was something. Faye noted afterward, in her private accounting of the situation, he could have dragged it out. He could have made it ugly and expensive and exhausting. He didn't. Whatever his faults. And she was not in the habit of cataloging them anymore, because that was a kind of grieving she had decided not to do. He had enough of his father's old-school dignity to understand when something wasn't his. She respected that in the way you can respect something in a person without it changing how you feel about the larger story. In March, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Faye gave a lecture at Yale School of Medicine. The auditorium held 400 people, and it was standing room. She talked about the science, which was what she always did. But she also talked, and this surprised people who knew her, because she was not a person given to autobiography in public. She talked about the years, the specific texture of the years when you are building something you believe in, and the evidence of that belief is not yet visible to anyone outside your own mind. The nights in the lab when the data didn't cooperate, the grant rejections, the trial that had to be redesigned from the ground up in year 3, the way it felt to hold a conviction about something important and have almost no way to prove it yet, she said. There is a version of ambition that announces itself, and then there is the kind that goes quiet and goes to work. I have always been the second kind. I used to think that was a limitation. I don't think that anymore. The room was very still afterward. A medical student, a young woman, who looked like she was running on coffee and Will, approached her with a question about the trial methodology. They talked for 12 minutes. Faye was not in a hurry. On the way out, a colleague who had known her for years fell into step beside her. "You seem different," he said. Faye considered that. "I think I've just got more room," she said. She bought a smaller house. That surprised people, too. With what she could now afford, the assumption was something conspicuous, something that announced what had happened. Instead, she found a house in Woodbridge with 4 bedrooms and a big kitchen, and a study that looked out onto a half-acre of yard that was mostly wild and needed work. The yard was the thing that sold her on it. She hadn't had a garden in 11 years. She planted things in April. She didn't know much about gardening. She knew biology, but gardening was something else. And she made the predictable beginner's mistakes, and some that were probably her own invention. Claudette sent her a book. Augustine's wife, who had been gardening for 20 years, came over one Saturday and walked the yard with her and offered specific, unsentimental advice. Faye found she liked the learning of it, liked the particular humility of trying something at which she was a genuine beginner, liked getting her hands dirty in a literal way for once. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes after a very long, loud stretch of time, and if you are lucky and you are paying attention, you can feel it not as absence but as space. She had not had space like this in more than a decade. She moved through it slowly, the way you move through a room you're learning by feel. She had a standing call with her attorneys on Mondays about the post-acquisition transition. She served on 2 advisory boards. She was in early conversations about a new research initiative. She wasn't ready to announce it, wasn't even ready to name it to herself yet, but she could feel its way. She had felt the shape of Vantage a decade ago, before it was anything you could write down. She had dinner with her mother every other Sunday. Sometimes her brother came too, and they ate too much and talked over each other, and her mother asked pointed questions about her sleep and her vegetables, and Faye answered them with the patient specificity of a daughter who knows when she is loved. On a Saturday in May, she was in the garden when her phone buzzed with a message she didn't recognize at first. The number was Harlan's. She looked at it for a moment. "I've been reading about the trial results. What your team built is extraordinary. I just wanted to say that. I hope you're well." She read it twice. She thought about the kitchen counter, the folder, his smile. "I think we both know this has been over for a long time." She thought about the Sunday afternoon kitchen at the table 4 years ago when she had tried to explain, and he had said sounds complicated and walked away. She thought about what it would have meant to her back then to have someone in that house who was curious about the thing she was building, who asked the next question, who wanted to understand. She thought about all of that, and then she put the phone face down on the garden wall and went back to what she was doing. The tomatoes needed staking. She had made that mistake last year at her mother's house and watched 3 plants go sideways by July. She had learned from it. She tied each stem with the care of someone for whom careful attention is not a personality trait, but a practice, the thing she had chosen over and over in 100 different rooms for as long as she could remember. The afternoon was warm. The yard smelled like soil and new green things. She did not write back.